Hidden History Happy Hour fans, welcome back. Imagine that you're in a city being faced by Russian occupiers, and that city is in Ukraine, and you need to protect yourself and your workers. And now imagine that you can hear this story directly from someone who lived it in Ukraine with Russia invading. That, H4 fans, is the special treat we have for you today. At the request of our special guest today, I will be drinking bourbon. And of course, though I don't always drink bourbon, when I do, I drink Blue Run bourbon. It's classic, it's delicious, and it remains the official bourbon of the Hidden History Happy Hour. Alex, welcome back. First official and most heartfelt congratulations on your forthcoming new book.
Thank you very much.
History.
The imaginatively titled More Lessons from History. The delay between the first volume and the second being the challenge of coming up with such an ingenious and unexpected title.
Cheers to that. Cheers. I know our viewers would love for you to pull back the curtain a little bit and tell us about the no doubt big bucks and endless polling and data analytics and focus groups that undoubtedly led to that revolutionary title.
Right. Well, I thought we might go with Lessons from History, Miami Takedown, something like that. But my publishers outrageously thought that was a bit obscure. I, by the way, am on Blue Run as well.
Awesome. Yes. Your first show.
Alan, what are you drinking?
I am drinking a Blue Run as well.
Get out. That
Amazing.
Not even people will never believe it. Not planned. That's fantastic.
Not planned. Very good. Welcome to our show, Alan. Alex, as one of our fans has commented, we don't seem to have to go out of our way to find amazing guests.
Yeah,
we just know them. Now, this is true, and it's also a little false because we don't just know them. We work very hard at our day jobs, and we're exceedingly careful about who and what companies we get involved with. And we're both fortunate now to have the luxury of choosing who we work with. And I have the pleasure and honor of officially working with and welcoming our special guest today, Mr. Alan Harlan. Alan is a career executive and owner of digital transformation services company Axis Software Dynamics, a custom software development organization based in Dallas, but with operations in Europe and in particular on this day in the Ukraine. Alan also is a phenomenal, multi-talented executive and currently the chief financial officer of Theon Technology, a revolutionary data security startup that I am proud to serve as an advisor and general counsel. Welcome, Alan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, gents. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I couldn't imagine spending it any better this weekend with you folks. So thank you for having me.
I know you're enjoying your Blue Run bourbon there in Dallas, Texas, where it's what, like 106 Fahrenheit?
It is. It's incredibly hot. I would gladly trade with either of you gents.
It's pretty hot in London. It's in the.
Is it?
This is not helpful for those doing different systems. It's in the 30s.
Which is hot.
Well, that's pretty warm. Yeah.
Alan, I know your Ukraine story, but Alex and our fans don't yet, and I can't wait for them to learn what I know. Alex, though, has a story a bit tangentially like what you lived through. So, Alex, why don't you kick it off?
Thank you very much, Brian. My favorite image of a defector, it's very specific because I think when you're picking your favorite defector, it's hard to look past Rudolf Nureyev, Milos Forman, Oleg Gurevsky, one of the bravest guys around that we will discuss one day on the podcast.
And most valuable intelligence source.
Incredible, one of the best assets that the West ever had. My favorite image of a defector is Konrad Schumann, who is the border guard who jumped the wire between East Germany and West Berlin as the Berlin Wall was being built in 1961. Schumann was in the BEPO, the Bereitschaftspolizei. If you're a German speaker and I flubbed that, tough luck.
You'll hear about it.
Indeed. And Schumann was the BEPO was like basically a paramilitary police organization, which was created to act as the boot by which the state would stamp down on rebellion. And its officers were selected and then trained to be loyal without question. And I suppose that's part of why one likes this example so much of someone defecting, because it shows that given the opportunity, some even amongst the enforcing class would prefer freedom to the repression in their own republic of watchers and informers. Schumann had been sent to guard the new barrier site, which started, you may remember the images, quite flimsy barbed wire and then got built up to keep people, they were sent there to keep people in the East in, as they started building what became the wall, and it became obvious that they were going to not be able to access West Berlin anymore. And that was the duty of a generation of bullies to come after the duty that he pulled in 61. Konrad Schumann was 19 years old on this day in 1961, and he was sent there 3 days after the construction of the wall had started. So his section was only barbed wire. And at his post, as he was standing there, as he told it later in life, giving interviews about it, he could see a young woman on his side of the wire passing a bouquet of flowers over the wire to an older woman that was obviously her mother in the West. And one can imagine the considerable emotional distress that they exhibited. And he thought to himself, who parts families like this? Who wishes to be part of a regime that does it? So unnoticed by his comrades, Schumann had pressed down a part of the wire that was near to him, and he passed word to a Westerner who was watching on the other side that he was going to jump. So the Western police arrived to whisk him away from the scene if he dared to actually do it, and he dared. He was standing guard by the low loops of barbed wire that you may remember in the photograph, and he had his back to his stone wall, and the crowd on the Western side were chanting, "You come over, come over." And
probably not the most helpful thing for a stealthy operation, but go on.
Well, quite, but I think that first of all, none of his comrades actually expected him to do it.
Yeah.
And secondly, I don't think his comrades expected him to do it. They imagined those chants were aimed at other people. And one of the things that makes, because a lot of these moments are lost in time, like tears in the rain. But what makes this one so remembered is that so many people were there, and the image is captured by so many different cameras from so many different angles. His leap for freedom gave the world one of the enduring images of the Cold War. His arms outstretched, his gun on his back, the muzzle facing downwards with the strap stretched tight in his hand, and his head is down, his face all but unseen beneath the helmet, so determined. It's like an everyman image for all of those who were repressed in the East. And after that, everything is epilogue and coda, but it is sad epilogue and coda, because after that great impetuous moment, I'm afraid life in the West did not bring Schumann happiness. He was relocated to Bavaria, far from the border. He found work and he married and he had a son, but he was forever full of regret and remorse and sadness and fear, because he wondered, am I going to be a target for retribution? As so many other defectors and critics had been, and few were as high profile as him after all. And he was left for the rest of his life, of course, for the rest of the time that the East endured, with worries of what would happen to his family that he'd left behind in the East because of him and what he'd done. And Schumann said that he never felt truly free until the wall, the barrier that he had jumped in 1961, the barrier so closely aligned with the barriers in his own life, came down in 1989. But you can wait for years thinking that some goal is the vital thing that fixes everything. If only this, then everything in life would be good. And sadly, that was not the case for him. When the wall came down, Schumann was met with bitter disappointment. He visited family. They were strangers to him. People who knew him before he had deserted, in inverted commas, and wanted nothing to do with him. So after the seemingly positive resolution of the conflict between East and West that had defined Schumann's life, and after the peace he had waited for so long, peace was not to be found for Konrad Schumann, and he hanged himself from a tree in his own orchard. I mean, without sounding too kind of Scandinavian existentialist, the lesson, I'm afraid, is rather bleak. We must all strive for happiness, and many will find it, but for others, some will never be happy without freedom, and others will never be happy away from their homeland. And sad to say, some will never be happy at all. But I think there is an irony in that makes this story so revealing and worth telling, because those unhappy souls who will never be happy can still provide all of us with these glorious soaring moments in what we see, in what we bear witness to, in what they do, which can serve both to inspire and to bring hope to a generation to come on both sides of a wall or a wire.
Yeah, inspirational indeed, although sad. I will say that the thing that I realize I've been waiting for all my life, that moment, is in fact a hidden history happy hour. And I am finding peace from it. So thank you. Thanks for putting that in perspective.
Excellent.
Alan,
Very good.
so
Thank you.
I know that you are, yeah, excellent story, Alex. I know that you're quite well traveled and that you specifically located your business in Eastern Europe because you wanted to experience it. Have you been to Berlin, and specifically, have you been to the Museum of the Wall?
I have not been to Berlin. I've been through Germany maybe 100 times, but never to Berlin. So something I've got to put on the bucket list and get over there for sure.
It's worth a visit. Just to Berlin is spectacular anyway. But this Museum of the Wall, Alex, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's quite moving. And there's many stories of East German soldiers who refused to fire on people that were fleeing, and then they themselves were punished. And it's quite a place, especially because the Cold War, memories of the Cold War are fading in some people's minds. I imagine we might have a few listeners that maybe didn't realize at the beginning of the story that we were talking about East Germany during the early period of Soviet Russian occupation. And sadly, not a lot has changed. Vladimir Putin of Russia is still reaching out and killing people he doesn't like. Thankfully, he never, or his predecessors never reached Schuman. But Alan, why don't you tell us how you got to Ukraine to begin with and what your experiences were there? And maybe we'll talk about what we could learn from that for current events.
Sure. Happy to. And thanks again for having me today. So, as you mentioned earlier, well-traveled, worked for a private equity fund out of Palo Alto, California for about 10 years, mainly had operations in India, been to India 57 times, into China. We had stuff in Nizhny Novgorod in Russia. So have been there, Latin America, Poland, a lot of operations into Scandinavia, Western Europe, all across North America. So basically, if you guys have spent any time traveling west into India, you definitely have a different perspective, and lump China into that as well. Although I had an opportunity to take over a CEO position in a company, it's actually based out of Ukraine. And if you, in my original introduction that Bryan went through, digital engineering space, digital transformation is where companies do outsource product development services for companies across the world. These are companies like Microsoft, Apple, basically can't get enough scale or hire enough developer engineers within their organizations. And they look for different skill sets like, data engineering. So you need skilled mathematicians, applied mathematics. And frankly, that's very rich across Eastern Europe.
Yeah, right. Very high standards of education.
Sure. So it's not uncommon to hire a PhD or MD to work in a life sciences data engineering project, something like that. So basically what I was doing is really kind of migrating from working in Asia to more of an Eastern Europe type go-to-market style. And this company had roughly about 3,000 engineers across Ukraine through 9 development centers. So Lviv, Kyiv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Rivne, even into Dnipropetrovsk to Kharkiv, going to the east, and as far as south as Sevastopol and Crimea. So when I started in 2013 working for this company, it was very dynamic, right? So had the opportunity to get a flat in Lviv on Chernoviska Street. Quite elegant. And I think that's the thing that really kind of strikes me is that whether you go to Kharkiv or Dnipropetrovsk or even to the coastal town, the laid back town of Sevastopol in Crimea, it's a very beautiful country. And I was quite, even when you think about what's occurring in the world today and you think about Eastern Ukraine, Donbass, Luhansk, and you think about what's occurring there, even in that time in 2013, 2014, 2015, it was very, very Ukrainian. A
Right.
lot of
Yeah.
yellow and blue, very proud of the country. And the citizens were just probably the most earnest, just patriotic folks that you could ever meet in your life.
Yeah.
And, so basically I go from being an American CEO to really what was starting to transform in 2013 was Viktor Yanukovych, who had really, if you look at the oligarchs within Russia today, Viktor Yanukovych was really embodied that same mentality. And I don't know the number specifically, but I do know that Yanukovych was basically took about 30 billion in funds out of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And so as you really got to really managing
And
your
sorry
business.
to interrupt you, Alex. So he was Alan. He was the president at the time when you got there, right? Yanukovych.
That's correct. That's correct.
And what was his relationship to Putin? Do we know?
Other than I would, quantify it as very similar to Lukashenko in Belarus. I mean, just a hardened Russia supporter, a Putin supporter, and obviously lived in the same mindset of a oligarch.
Yeah.
And really, how much money can I siphon from this country, from these regions, to funnel back to Putin from that perspective.
Yeah.
And so basically what you saw, is, going from running these companies to beginning to go to basically meetings, where, the mindset was Slava Ukraini, Heroam Slava. So glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes, and really the embodiment of the Ukrainian people, and really how they'd really had enough of that oligarch mentality, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you've spent any time, in that region, you go to the Western Ukraine, it's very European. It wants to adopt those ideals. And at the time, there was a big mindset to move Ukraine into Europe, the EU, and also move it into NATO as well. I think some of the the basis you needed as a company within Ukraine, you needed to be audited by a big accounting firm, and really do business the right way, financially, as opposed to really funding the local government per se, who may want to take your servers because you didn't pay your Microsoft license or whatever.
Well, it sounds a bit like a protection racket.
Very, I would say mafioso. But I think when you're paying a police chief and he's making £15,000 or an equivalent in hryvnia on an annualized basis, how do they make £100,000 a year? And they do it through these subversive means, right? So and it wouldn't be uncommon for Yanukovych or even Putin, as he's known to do, is to walk into your business and say, hey, I'm your new partner today, right? So this is obviously how you start siphoning funds to these oligarchs. So you had that mindset going on in the country, and it was really quite a dilemma, because how do you migrate from, this undercurrent making, £100,000 a day to something that's much more, standard to with that particular rate, right? So you had these undercurrents that are going on, but so the first thing I would say is that you really started to see people that wanted to get to that European lifestyle, that wanted to move in that direction. And I will say it was not only from Kyiv West, but it was also in the East. Even though today, when you start looking at Luhansk and Donbass regions, and I know there's Russian separatist regions within those areas, but it still is very largely Ukrainian. And as I mentioned earlier, very proud of what they were doing. So basically, as we moved on into 2013, this is when we started to see Euromaidan. And Euro Square is the big square in Kyiv, and I'm sure both of you guys have been there. Yeah, but just it embodies Ukrainian mentality, Ukrainian life. I would say it was a very European mindset from that standpoint. But what you saw in this Maidan, in this town square, was really a movement that went from a beautiful place where families were out to really a full-scale military operation. From Ukrainian people that were pushing it back against Yanukovych, and to form the Maidan Revolution. And so myself personally, I probably had 600 to 700 professional software engineers working in Kyiv, as well as across Ukraine. And the biggest dichotomy is they would come to work during the day, and then at night they would leave to do their military job. And the military job is, if you thought about the presidential palace in Kyiv, Yanukovych would have the Ukrainian military basically around the presidential palace, right? Because it got to be, I would say Yanukovych, he was obviously very paranoid, but he got to the point where Ukrainian people were getting so upset and organized back against what Yanukovych was doing, that they were starting to build military bunkers. I actually had the ability to go down and go into the center of Euromaidan, to the Ukrainian people, to the revolution headquarters, right, where they had their military, and walk down, and they want to know, what's your purpose of being here?
Now let's hold on, Alan. Let's unpack this a little bit, because I think people may be getting confused. So you're saying that there was the Ukrainian government, actual military run by Yanukovych, the president, that was basically his personal guard force. And then as the revolution started to really kick into gear, I think you're saying there was a separate military that was being built in secret, covertly, by the European the people that were hoping to join Europe. Do I have that right?
Yeah. And I think it went from very covert to open and outward, right? As they start to, not unlike you're seeing today in Ukraine. So you're starting to see, other countries starting to contribute, but these Ukrainians were basically getting their own weapons, whatever it took, to formulate an offensive back against the Ukrainian military.
So these are software engineers by day and essentially armed rebels by night.
Exactly.
And tell us about your visit to the bunker then. That's my term, not yours.
Yeah. So it truly was a bunker. If you think about sandbags and all piled up to withstand a helicopter attack or tanks. They had tanks and helicopters and everything around there. But basically creating a resistance to say that, hey, no more, and we'll use, force to do this. And I can say, as you walk out of your office during the day and you walk into this military operation at night, it was very surreal.
Yeah, I would think so.
And, it really kind of takes you out of the life of a CEO of a software development company, to understanding what's going on. We even got to walk up. We walked directly up to Ukrainian military protecting Yanukovych, and very staunch, with them holding AK-47, guns. So it was, on one hand, you're going, hey, nothing's going to happen to me. On the other hand, you're right in the forefront.
Yeah.
And eventually it got to the point where everything just went into mass chaos, where you had Molotov cocktails, from the Ukraine people to the Ukrainian military. And I think from probably from a U.S. standpoint, we read about it daily, from Uvalde, from what occurs in Buffalo, New York, too. And I think for me, the simplest thing is like South Chicago, where you have hundreds of murders a year. And it's not uncommon to have multiple hundred within a summer. But once Ukraine's military protecting Yanukovych attacked with snipers the Ukraine people,
Right.
in the beginning of 2014, and you had 50 people, Ukrainians, that were shot, killed, software engineers to farmers to every walk of life that wanted to protect the Ukrainian way of life and existence, and that movement that they made to more of a free lifestyle, right?
Yep.
To expand, to grow their economies. To see this, I've never seen such distraught, such hopelessness of people I worked with to see these murders.
Well, let me ask you this, Alan. You're essentially painting a picture of ordinary people with extraordinary courage who were willing to lose their lives in order to get the Western lifestyle or European values. What was their daily life like when they weren't fighting? In other words, how repressive was the Yanukovych regime? Was it sort of a police state, or was it really more they lived an okay life, but they wanted something much better because they laid down their lives for it?
Yeah. That's a very good question, a very interesting question, right? So I think at the time, at the end of 2013 and to the first of 2014, when Yanukovych was actually overthrown, there was an essence of a police state, but I think it's very much like you see today. You really have, when you look at Ukraine, you look at everything from Kyiv west, and I'd say that's very European, right? If you're
in a European city.
Yeah. You could be somewhere in France or Austria. I mean, it's very quaint. It's very European, right? And it's not too far from the Polish border.
Well, except for the occasional artillery shells these days. But
now,
yes.
Yeah, but still very strategic where they
Oh,
shoot, right? Yeah, but even in the time, right? And so once you go east, at that time you had Russian separatists that were coming into Donbass. It was kind of interesting, when all this was going down, right? So when everything started to really hit the fan, if you will, it really transitioned quite a bit to a military operation, but it was very segmented. It was very targeted.
Mm-hmm.
Like Russia came in and took over Crimea. We had about 200 developers in Crimea.
Oh my gosh.
Actually in Sevastopol. So we had to shut that operation down because U.S. clients did not want to deal with anything to do with Russia at the time. So you had those types of ideals. But, I think on one hand you have, and I'm trying to answer your question, on one hand you have that Russian way of life, where a family lives in a kind of a box style communistic apartment, but it's
cinder
theirs.
block.
Yep, exactly. Right. And you can have multi-generational families living in these environments, but it's what they know. But on the flip side, they are hoping for more, promise and more of a way of life, right?
Yeah.
That's not as constrictive, something that is more European. And I think it's kind of, if I look at Crimea, Putin and Russia came into Crimea. They had a scam election in 2014. And basically most of the people that lived in Crimea at the time were older Russians. The men grew up in the Russian military. They served in the Russian military. Even some of the board of directors I worked with, they were in the Russian military.
Oh, wow.
Before the USSR, and in 1990 or so. So they know that way of life. And so in Crimea, it was no problem because everybody said, oh, we're going back to Russia. That's the way it is. But if you tried to do that in Western Ukraine, it's got a totally different meaning, a totally different context, if you will. And I'm also trying to paint the picture that even in Kharkiv and Donbass and, Eastern Ukraine,
In the East,
there's still so much pride, for Ukraine as a country, right? And I do think you have spots of Russian separatists, but it's very Ukraine, and it's unfortunate that Russia's carving out that Eastern piece today. So they have a pathway to the Black Sea, to the Sea of
Right.
Azov.
And they
So
can cut Ukraine off from the sea. Yeah.
yeah, right. So that's where their military bases are, naval bases, so it's very strategic to them from that perspective, right? So I got to see all that dichotomy between those two.
So in that 2013, 2014 timeframe, did you lose people? Did you lose facilities? Were any of your buildings hit? I know the Crimea takeover, the invasion by today's horrific war crime standards by Russia was pretty bloodless, but how close were your people and your facilities to the death and destruction?
So probably the closest was Kyiv. So where you had Euromaidan and those pieces, and we had developers killed by snipers. In the scheme of things, as I compare it to Chicago, it's very tumultuous. And when national television, BBC, CNN, whatever, right, when they broadcast riots, Ukrainian military for Yanukovych, killing, shooting, and Molotov cocktails and fights going on. It was very, very volatile, very precarious. On the other hand, I will say that I found our employees, and I think just generally the people of Ukraine, to be very sincere, to be probably the most balanced people. They would show up, they would sit on conference calls, they would be very professional, but when 5 o'clock came, 1700 hours, they would walk out of that building to go do their duty, for their country, right? So they did their best to keep the company intact, but also to protect their country and move forward from that, right?
Yeah, so I know one of your first priorities is the safety and security of your people, and so don't answer this if you can't. But are some of those same people in the fight today also?
Yeah, in fact, you guys know LinkedIn, and it's not uncommon daily or at least weekly to have somebody that you knew and you worked with, that's posted, "Hey, please remember Andriy, father of three, our colleague for 15, 20 years, was killed today." And unfortunately, it's going to get, it's going to get a lot worse, I think.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But I think, for me, there were some really cool aspects. John McCain actually came to Kyiv at the time and spoke to the crowd. And you'd hear everybody, say, Slava Ukraine, Heroam Slava, very patriotic, again, very surreal, but very cool to watch that.
Yeah.
But then, just Russian separatists coming in Donbass, melee jet, shot down by, Russian separatists and Russian missiles. So really, it went from a very promising, high growth company, actually still doing very well, but it got really, really quite precarious over the time in that 2013, 2014, and basically resurfacing today.
And these separatists, Russian separatists that came in, for those listening, I just did air quotes. I don't know if you could hear it in my voice. Were they actual people that really wanted to be part of Russia? Were they soldiers? Were they the little green men in disguise? Who are those people?
I think they're just for hire military folks. Yeah. So, at the time, and I think there was, I say when Putin went into Crimea and took Crimea, there was little, I know there were sanctions by Obama, but in reference to somebody coming in and taking a piece of the sovereign country, there was very, very little that happened.
No, that was, we might as well have just waved a red flag in front of the bull. It was, I'm going to say, shameful in hindsight, for sure.
So that was definitely a downside. And I do think that Putin did not want to take Russian military and directly move into eastern Ukraine. So it was very easier and less political inference for him to send in mercenaries
Yeah.
to fight those wars, right? And as they came into Ukraine this year, was all based on Russian separatists and Nazis, and
Yeah.
and the harm that was coming back against to those Russian-speaking countries. So same premise, only this time he sent in the Russian military, from that perspective. So, I think the good thing that came out of this was that from 2013, 2014, the CIA and the really everything along NATO had the ability to train Ukraine forces. And I will say that, and you and I have discussed this, I think it was a vast mistake to think by the West to think that Russia was going to come in and just overrun Ukraine. And it was because of the preparation by the West, by NATO, that really hardened Ukrainian military and provided weaponry to defend against Russia. So I think it was, if we look at military intelligence and that fact that Russia was going to come in and dominate Ukraine, I feel very strongly we got that wrong, and that we didn't act as quick as we should have in the front end.
Yeah, I agree with that. Although I will say that having had some experience in this area myself, back during the long ago Iran-Iraq wars, when I was an intelligence officer, there is this strange phenomenon that political leaders, and I've seen it in both parties, discount the advice that their spies and their analysts give them if it doesn't fit with the narrative that they want to believe. And both sides get this wrong. Intelligence officers tend to have a mindset of, if any president disagrees with them, that president must be a political hack. Whereas in reality, and same thing with prime ministers, I'm sure, Alex, yes, you hear the intelligence reports, you listen to the analysis, most presidents do, but you have a much bigger canvas that you're painting on. You have a lot of other things going on politically, economically, that your spy service may not even know. On the other hand, and this was very true in the Iran-Iraq war, as it turned out, how do you explain, I'm taking your premise as a fact, I don't know it to be a fact, that the CIA was in there training the Ukrainian national military and rebels. How do those people not get in the room when a decision's being made? Because obviously, if they're there training the forces, if they knew what they were capable of, and yet that doesn't seem to have factored at all into the decisions, as far as we can tell. There's not really a question in there. It's just a very long comment. But how do you, I think we've all been tremendously inspired by the Ukrainian people in this moment in history. And despite the fact that we're now in the summer of 2022, and unfortunately the Russians seem to be doing better, I don't know how you can watch what those people have done, the Ukrainian people, and watch what their president has done, and watch how the West has responded, and not believe the Russians can't win this. What are your thoughts on what's going to happen there?
So I think, if you're asking me, I think that, so I think the resolve of Ukraine is phenomenal. I think everybody underestimated that. I am quite pleased at the West and the amount of arms that are pouring in from the West. I do think that Russia militarily, I think was way overestimated.
Yeah.
From that perspective. So I don't think that if we had to look at initially, Russia was just going to walk through Ukraine, go to Moldova, maybe Poland, just keep going and take the entire country, or at least take Kyiv, from that perspective. But I do think that Russia's a lot weaker than what we perceived initially. I think just the economic toll that Russia's taken based upon Western sanctions And it may not be immediate, but I do think they were weakened by 30 years. Something from an economic basis. So my point is, they're not as, they haven't been as effective as we thought they were. They may achieve their goals, they may win the battle, but I think they've lost the war.
Yeah.
Specifically, if you take about, the Finns and the Swedes going into NATO. And I think it's just the military buildup by NATO. And the amount of arms and focus that's pouring into that region. So, so will they accomplish? And initially, I thought they would take the eastern Ukraine, and have, like you said, right, block off Ukraine's access to the Black Sea from a shipping port, but also a military strategic landmass into Crimea, and they're achieving that. I think they will win that, but over the long haul, I think they've been dramatically weakened. This may just be wishful thinking, but I do think that in terms of Russia being a superpower, I think they're dramatically weakened and will be reduced. And you hear the things about Putin's health, and I do think that's a key indicator when Putin goes out. At least maybe it's wishful thinking, but I'm thinking that it moves more in a European alignment as opposed to a Russian historical thinking.
Hey, Bryan, I have a couple of caveats to that whilst I'm topping myself up with some orderly run. The first caveat is I agree with everything you said about Russia's being diminished on the world stage. But and you were not doing this for a moment, so I don't mean you, Alan, but a lot of people talk about us, the West, having cut Russia off from the world. And that's not true. We've cut Russia off from the Western world. And I was reflecting on this as you were talking at the beginning about your experiences in China and India, markets, and the Middle East, markets that have proven far more willing to be open to Russia activity and exchange than the West. The second interesting thing I think about what you said was that you thought they would seek to take the East, and that's right. And there's a word for this in history. It's Finlandization. The Finns gave up about 10% of their country to have peace with Russia. And if history is anything to go by, that's the kind of inverted compromise, inverted commas compromise, disgraceful bullying that Putin is going to be aiming at. And whilst one, last but not least, cannot but admire the Ukrainians in the way that you and Bryan have both set out for their resolve, the way that some in the West have behaved as we get there is really disappointing. It's disappointing to me that Britain had to fly sorties around Germany to get material to Ukraine. A friend of mine who was very senior in the armed forces talked to me about this after we discussed it on one of our episodes, and I realized that if anything, I'd lowballed the impact of that, because when you think about logistics, every mile you add to the journey adds remarkably to the cost, what you can transport, the weight of what you can transport, and it's a big bit of dirt you have to fly around to avoid German airspace. They were a material cost of thousands of man hours, probably tens of thousands of items that we could otherwise have transported in the time that we were doing it. And last but not least, I've been really disappointed by the fact that Germany's remained on the receiving end of significant amounts of energy from Russia, as prices globally have spiked, making that worth more to send to Russia. And I appreciate that they, by dint of their own choices on their energy mix, have made themselves so dependent on it, they would have struggled to see another way. Whilst Nord Stream 2 has been stopped now, Nord Stream 1 is still going. And the Germans are paying through that a very significant amount of revenue, or have been until very recently, to Russia in an environment where energy prices are spiking. So for much of the invasion period, Germany has been paying Russia circa $1 billion a month. That will go some way to subsidizing an invasion. And I don't mean it too provocatively to our German friends to say that the Germans, by dint of their energy choices, have been subsidizing the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's most unfortunate. And I think it, at least in the beginning of the conflict, probably gave Putin a lot of comfort and aid to see even that amount of distance between the US and the UK on the one hand and Germany, because after all, that's part of his strategic goal, was to split Europe and the US into split NATO. And as Alan points out, he lost that spectacularly with Finland and Sweden, but I think the jury's still out on Germany.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, overall, it must be a profound negative for Putin to have driven further, as they see them, border countries into the arms of NATO. But nevertheless, it's been some countries simply haven't honoured the promises they made about equipment that they're going to send to Ukraine and so forth too. So it's not all a rosy picture, I'm afraid.
Well, the inverse is also true, though, and I just want to raise a glass to the UK's leadership in this area. I think President Biden has done an overall pretty good job, but
cheers.
As has happened several times before in history, I think UK has stiffened the spine of we Americans at a very, very important time in history.
Agreed. Totally agree.
Thank you very much. And it's whatever else you think of him in his time as Prime Minister, Boris Johnson led the way on that, and it's worth mentioning that, I think, as he's resigned his office, that is an achievement that the Ukrainians are first to recognize, actually.
Yeah.
There was this incredible thing when Boris Johnson announced his resignation, where across Ukraine, businesses and public sector organizations adapted their logos and their strap lines. So they had this kind of very recognizable shock of blonde hair on top of an O in the middle of a name, or instead of the dot on top of an I. And it was a heck of a tribute.
Well, that moment where he popped up in the middle of the square did
it twice.
It was both times, and it was not only quite an achievement from a security standpoint, but just for morale, it's invaluable. And again, thanks for that.
Yeah,
Alan.
Yeah.
What's the morale and what's the security situation, to the extent you can say, with your folks in Ukraine today in the summer of 2022? Are you feeling, they're relatively safe, or are they really in the thick of it, or what's going on there?
Well, I think, you can compare what's currently happening today to back into even 2013, 2014 Ukraine's government has imposed a mandate that from 18 to 60 years old, males must enter into the service. You can't leave the country. And even back then, there were ways around that. Some of the physical efforts, the way they served you. But by and large, the men are doing all they can in that regard, right? So I still think you have that dichotomy that by day they're doing their job, by night they're waging war. I think for me, the biggest travesty is the families, the women and children. When you look at a country that's 46 million people, and you've had probably, the last I saw was north of 12 million women and children that have been displaced. And that's not only in the East, that's in largely across the West, because, probably, standard profiles of families, the men take the risk, they send the women and children, they go to Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, wherever they're moving to. You've seen this mass exodus. So, I think on one hand, very resilient people, but on the other hand, you cannot overlook the displacement of 12 million people and the families and their lives and what's going on. I will say that some of the West is fairly stable, so you've kind of had folks that have moved back in. But I mean, it just to me, it's really sad that you've seen such an upsetting of just standard lives and probably mindsets of children for years to come.
Oh, generations.
Yeah. And so there's good and bad out of everything. I will say that they've adapted. They move into other countries to continue to run. Poland being probably the closest example. Even back when in 2013, 2014, we moved into Bulgaria, Sofia, and then also into Wrocław, Poland. And, so, I mean, there's ebb and flow that occurs. There's just some underlying fundamentals that just break my heart, though.
Yeah. Well, talk about digital transformation, though. I mean, this, whether it's the Starlink communication system that the West stood up there, whether it's the way that the Ukrainians have adapted these drones to modern warfare, they've already got, I believe, a minister for digital transformation who is, while they're fighting the war, securing funding and creating programs to rebuild Ukraine as a much more digitally advanced society. And not that they weren't before. They've been leaders in that area, and I'm sure your folks have been some of those leaders all along. But it's quite remarkable, really, what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when you get into Eastern Europe, and ex-Soviet countries, like Ukraine, like Belarus, and having spent the time that I did in India and China, and a lot of time in India, where they're graduating probably 1 million engineers a year. And if you get into really the block of Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and Hungary and Poland, maybe it's closer to, I don't know, 25, 30,000 engineers a year. But I will say that the mindsets of applied mathematics engineers, it's much more, I think, in the East, it's much more well suited to software development. Yeah. Right. It's not as general. So you have some world-class data scientists and just pure engineers that come out of Eastern Ukraine. And their expectation, I think they're they have a basis to push back. Specifically on Western European businessmen or business people, and also across North America as well too. So I think their delivery is quite a bit more stable in that regard. So there's some definitive advantages, and I think there's good people across the world, and there's smart people across the world. But I do think that's one thing that really Eastern Europe has going for it, and even Russia as well too, is just the class of engineers. And frankly, Mark Andreessen, software is eating the world, and you're only going to see this digitalization rather, of economies, of technologies, of industries. And you're going to need more and more engineers, right? So there's not going to be a preponderance of focus by one country, and you're going to see global growth in this area. So yeah.
Yeah, a very senior official at Avast told me one time that they very strategically located their software development in the Czech Republic for exactly this reason, that it's much more prioritized, it's much more focused learning, and they have much greater sort of practical day-to-day software development skills when they get out of school than a lot of places in the West. Look, we could do this all day, and we've taken a lot of your time. We, as you know, we do a history show with a few cocktails, but
yeah, thanks.
Rarely
Rarely
do we get an actual witness to history as it's being made. And so hopefully we're doing a little bit of the first draft of the history of a resurgent Ukraine, and maybe we'll look back on this in a few years and be happy that we were optimistic.
Hey, Alan, come back and talk to us in a little while and update us, because I think you've been fascinating to listen to. You'll know I haven't said very much because you're a great person to learn from. But I also want you to know that we're thinking about your staff out there. And
yes.
This wasn't just an exercise in getting your thoughts. It's also an opportunity for people to hear about what is happening for people who do jobs who are just like us, who just happen to be unlucky enough to have been in a country that's been unjustifiably invaded. And there's any small bit we can do to publicize that, we're really proud to.
Very well said.
Thank you so much.
I completely agree. And I guess that leads me to one last question, Alan, which is, I suspect a number of our viewers and listeners are going to be motivated to try to help. Do you have a favorite set of NGOs, or how could people help?
So, you can go online, you can Google it, and you can donate directly to Ukraine's military.
Yeah.
I choose to donate and funnel money so it goes directly to the military, to Zelensky, so that they can manage that money that way. I've also found that UNICEF is another good funding vehicle. Not only do they help across Ukraine, but they also help in the border countries like Poland, where you've had this mass exodus of people, right? So, so please give, this is one of the things that's going to be for the long haul.
Yeah.
And, some really, Slava Ukraine. I mean, I just think there's some real, there's some great people there, smart people, just wonderful hearts. And so please give.
We are going to vet with you the links that are in the show notes as our viewers and listeners are enjoying this podcast. So what's in our show notes will have been confirmed as not being a scam, because in Alex's and my day job, we do a lot of data security, cybersecurity, and there are a lot of scams out there. But folks, you've heard this directly from someone who has people in harm's way. So please give what you can. And Alan, we will have you back. We are not going to give up on this story. I'm a little concerned that the West is getting a bit of media fatigue at this point, but it's not going to happen on this podcast, and we will definitely have you back.
Thank you, Alan.
Excellent.
Cheers.
Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, guys. Cheers. Cheers. Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate your time.